our webinar on scaling inclusive business. We're going to hear about Ted's framework and Olivier's pathway and a host of insights and top tips and some challenges, and explore, can we solve the challenges facing inclusive businesses trying to scale? We're going to start in just a minute. People are still logging in and we have a great array of people joining us today. So meanwhile, let me just introduce the organisations behind the event and some other resources, and then explain to you the structure of our webinar today. So the webinar is organised by the Practitioner Hub for Inclusive Business in partnership with the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan, which is where Ted is from, Hystra Hybrid Strategies Consulting, which is where Olivier is from, and sponsored by the UK Department for International Development, or UK Aid, as you can see. We're on Twitter and online on the webinar page. Now, this webinar is part of a series all focused on the issue of scaling inclusive business. We recently sent out from the Practitioner Hub our November series, which is all about scaling. It was actually in 2 parts. We had such rich content that you have the bit.ly address there to the entire series, the newsletter, which is full of blogs all about scaling inclusive business. We also have a know-how page on scale now on the Practitioner Hub in partnership with the William Davidson Institute, which is a long-term resource on this topic which gets updated regularly. And just last week we launched a new checklist, 4-page checklist for entrepreneurs. Have a look, see, am I meeting this, am I meeting that, am I doing what is necessary to scale? A few ideas condensed into 4 pages. So after the webinar, feel free to look at those. We will be sending you emails after the webinar with links to this webinar and its related slides. Now, I think we have people pretty much logged in. We are going to run for an hour. At the end of the hour, I realise people need to get back to whatever they're doing, but if you have questions that haven't been answered at that point, our 2 presenters are willing to stay on for another 10 to 15 minutes to finish up answering the questions, though I realise a lot of people will leave on the hour. So let's start our conversation. At any time at all, you can type your questions in chat. We're going to have an introductory discussion. We're going to have a few slides and presentations from both our experts, some discussion, and then open it to general chat. But type your questions in the chat function at any time. Please, after we finish, we will send you a short feedback questionnaire. We do need your feedback. We need to know what's useful, we need to know what to improve, and we need that to get future funding for webinars, so please fill it in. And as I said, join us on Twitter anytime. So I am delighted to introduce today Olivier Kayser, who's the founder and CEO of Hystra, and Ted London, who's the Vice President and Senior Research Fellow at the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. Both these gents have written books. Let me just show you. Happened to both write books last year on scaling at the base of the pyramid, and we thought it was too much of a coincidence that these 2 great thinkers and practitioners have both been considering this core issue at the same time. Hence, we're delighted to bring them together today. And when I say they're practitioners and thinkers, they really are. They're both actively engaging with companies all the time, but they're both thinking very hard and sharing their thinking, which is why I think today's conversation is going to be so good. And myself, I'm Caroline Ashley. I'm the editor of the Practitioner Hub for Inclusive Business. So we're going to think about scale rather than failure or bumping along at the bottom. We're going to explore what enables a business to scale. We're going to get key insights from both of them based on their books, and then we'll have the discussion, as I said. I want to start off asking both of you just your perspective on what are we talking about with scale. Olivier, could you share with us how you see the question of scaling an inclusive business, and perhaps with an example of something that either didn't manage to scale or did manage to scale, just to help us set the boundaries of our conversation?
Thank you, Caroline. I think scale is really about achieving impact at the scale of the problem, and basically addressing a problem at scale, eradicating a problem. And there are many ways of achieving this. Oftentimes it's about affecting, changing government policy. It's about creating a social movement. But in the particular case of today, I think we are addressing the issue of how to address scale with a business model. That could be done through replication or through actually the growth of one individual organization. I think 2 examples that come to my mind when we talk about scale. A positive story is the one of Gramin Shakti in Bangladesh that addressed the issue of lack of electricity in rural Bangladesh, about 40% of the population doesn't have access to the grid. And they developed solar home systems in a way that was sustainable, commercially sustainable. And they have reached by themselves about 2 million households. But most interestingly is that their example was followed by competitors. And this is a total 4 million solar home systems that were actually installed in Bangladesh, i.e. around 20 million people, or a third of the people in need. This, at the scale of Bangladesh, I would say, is scale. At the opposite end of the spectrum, I think one of the most frustrating positive cases I know of is the one of Codensa in Colombia, in Bogota, which is an electric utility that has found a very impressive way of providing access to microcredit to poor families, leveraging their assets, which is their list of customers, their invoicing and money collection systems. And they have managed to build a $400 million loan portfolio, providing loans at a much lower cost than microfinance institutions. So it's a fantastic innovation. And one would think that this situation applies in many other countries. Unfortunately, it has been copied by the gas utility in Bogota, but it hasn't spread across the world. And this project has been successful for at least 10 years, and the replication has not taken place.
Great, thank you. And maybe we'll come back later then to the question of why that hasn't replicated elsewhere if it's been so successful. Ted, could you share with us your understanding of what it is to go to scale, and perhaps an example to shed light on that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Caroline, and thank you and Olivier for allowing me to participate. This should be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So scale, when I think about it, is really the reason why we get excited about business being engaged in low-income markets in the base of the pyramid. The idea is, when we think about development in general and grants, I think they're terrific, but the question always arises is what happens when the money runs out? And can we go further than the initial investment allows us to do? And both of those are answered by scale, and I think that that's a crucial role for business to play is being sustainable at scale. When I think about scale, it's really the idea that a business is building something internally, the capabilities, the team to go from one market to another without having to reinvent everything. So they can go faster, they can go more efficiently from place to place. And that's what scale is in a company. It's being able to take things internally from one place to another. Support. And I think that remains the biggest challenge for us interested in low-income markets. It's that we just haven't seen enough scale. And that's the promise. And an example of scale certainly is mobile telephony, where you're beginning, if you go back to 2000, so just 16 years ago, less than half of humanity or half of humanity had not made a phone call yet. And now you go out and you look in the rural markets, and even if cell phones aren't ubiquitous, access to cell phones is increasingly ubiquitous. So you're seeing more and more that model has worked. We're seeing some in ag. Olivier's, I know, knows a few others that have, but in general, I think too few have really scaled. And that's the big challenge is, I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves is how can we enable more base of the pyramid enterprises to scale? What do we need to do to help them become more likely to scale? And I think that, to me, remains, at this time, the number one challenge in this space is really about getting to scale.
Great, thank you both. Well, Ted, let's kick off with your few slides, particularly as I'm doing such a bad job of controlling the slides my end. I think you take charge of the screen and share your screen and talk us through a few of the key elements from your book, and then we'll hear a few key elements from Olivier, and then we'll get the discussion going.
I'm not sure I'm going to do any better than you, Caroline, but I'm going to try. Let's see.
Yeah, my mouse doesn't like this.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So, I was asked to keep this at about 5 minutes or so, and I'm happy to, as we go through, if there are questions, I'm happy to dive into more detail across anything I discuss, but I just kind of want to set the table a little bit. And I think what attracted me, and I suspect that many of the folks on this call, is this BLP promise, the idea that we can create sustainable, scalable enterprises that truly alleviate poverty. And what made it attractive in many respects and different was it wasn't about business doing it themselves, because if they could have done it, they would have already done it. And it wasn't about development doing it themselves, because if they could have done it, they would have already done it. It was really the idea that how do we bring two sectors that historically have worked separately together in a new and important way? And that's both the opportunity and the challenge that we face. And just sort of setting the stage. Well, that's interesting, because now I can't change my slides. Okay, there we go.
Well done.
All right, growing momentum. So, when I got involved in this, and I guess I first touched base with this in 1989 when I went to Malawi as a Peace Corps volunteer after doing my business degree and being a senior consultant. And I really began to think about what's the role in business addressing social issues. And I've been at it now, I guess, almost 30 years. And as Caroline mentioned, now I'm at the University of Michigan, both on the faculty at the Ross School of Business and vice president of the Scaling Impact Initiative at WDI and at the William Davidson Institute. With the real focus, we work a lot in the field with our partner organizations, and there are dozens and dozens of leadership teams across different sectors. And what I've certainly seen over this time is those who've been long enough, that the conversation has changed. If you dial back 10 or 15 years ago, it was often seen, and in some respects still is in some quarters, that business was part of the problem. But I think more and more we're seeing business as part of the solution. And the question then is how do we engage them? And that's moved more from business as a philanthropic partner to business as a scaling partner, as someone that we want to build business models that work economically. There's growing interest. We're seeing more companies and development organizations getting engaged in this, unlocking new resources. Certainly, when I got involved with this, I don't think there was such a thing as impact investing. And even in the last 5 or 10 years, you've just seen that taking off. And that has some strengths and certainly limitations as well, but a powerful new resource. And then here at the University of Michigan, I see this, but also out in the field, that we're seeing some of the best and brightest people on the planet beginning to think about these issues. So that's the good news. But we've had mixed venture success, which isn't so surprising. When you think about launching any business anywhere, whether it's in the UK or France or the United States, it's going to be difficult. But I think we've been disappointed in the results so far in low-income markets. And I'm going to argue that perhaps there are 3 things going on here. One is there are certainly a lot of pilots. There's no doubt about it. But I'm not sure that these have been set up to go to scale in many cases. A lot of times people set up pilots to be pilots. And we haven't seen enough scalable enterprises. Excuse me. So we need more of our pilots to go to scale. We've had a lot of activity, so we're seeing lots and lots of things happen, but we haven't seen enough of what have we learned. We've had successes and failures, but what is it that we've really learned from all this journey over the past 10 or 15 years? What are the lessons? And then similarly, there have been lots of cases and reports, but what are the best practices? And, I sit at a business school in the US, and as a school, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we make businesses more successful, but we do that in the developed world context. And I think we need to apply more of that, not just at business schools, but across the globe, and thinking about that in the developing world, and particularly not just the developing world, but in the low-income markets, the informal economy. What are the best practices? And I think what we need is a toolkit that we can't guarantee success, but we can enhance the likelihood of success. And that's what this book I wrote was really about, was beginning to say, what are the tools and strategies and frameworks that managers can use to increase their likelihood of success based on what we've learned over the past 15 years or so? And for me, going all the way back to 1989. And this was sort of just a quote from the book to give you a sense. We have seen the promise of sustainable, scalable BOP impact enterprises, but we have to do more to truly deliver on that promise. We must continue to draw lessons from the experiences, the successes and frustrations of enterprises operating in the field, and identify what works and what doesn't. I get a little bit tired of going to events, and I understand why, where everyone tells us how great they're doing. And I think that's interesting. And when that happens, if I get the opportunity, I often ask them, maybe not during their session, but afterwards, is what have you learned? What were what led you to where you are, and what are the biggest challenges you face? I think that's a much more interesting question for us. It's not, are you successful, but what got you where you are and what do you still need to do to really go to scale? And the way I think about it is around this idea of standardized tools. That if you think about it in the developed world, we have lots of standardized tools. So we've got, Porter's 5 forces, the 4 P's of marketing, SWOT analysis, lots of things that are standardized at the level of the enterprise, but then can be customized by different enterprises. And you think about the tools I just mentioned, they can be used, if you think about the SWOT analysis or the Porter's 5 forces, they can be used by any enterprise at any stage of growth across different geographies, across different sectors. So we can build standardized tools that can be customized. And we need to do that in low-income markets because, frankly, you don't know what you don't know. And part of the benefit of a tool is it allows you to begin to think about the environment, the business opportunity more holistically. If you were left on your own to think about the 5 forces, you might come up with 3, or whatever it would be. And this allows you to begin to understand all 5 and then assess what's important because you're operating with constrained resources. So it begins to allow you to think more clearly about how to prioritize. So again, if you have these frameworks, you can understand the full opportunity and then strategize about making good decisions. So that's what, I built in this framework. And this is my last slide, and I'm not going to go through them all in depth, but just talk about each one briefly. One is, and I know these are difficult to see, and again, I can talk more later, but one is what I've seen repeatedly is enterprises set themselves up incorrectly. They have the wrong resources, the wrong metrics. They struggle with the appropriate questions around problem solving. They don't have the right structure. And what I've seen time and again is if you don't set yourself up right internally at the beginning, the chances of success diminish drastically. And you need to make sure what are your metrics of success? What are you really thinking about? How do you learn while also seeking growth? How do you build the right team? How do you get the right financing? What are the problems you need to solve? Who do you need to solve them with? How do you set yourself up internally? Or as a startup, what is the right legal structure to select? So, that's one, how do you set yourself up for success? And then I think that you have to really think about planning from scale from the start. And that's really how do you co-create at the very beginning to get yourself off and running? How do you make sure your pilots are properly geared toward innovation? And then how do you think about embedding and building competitive advantage and creating capabilities that can sustain you in the market and then allow you to scale from place to place? The next would be, how do you understand the value proposition from the perspective of the base of the pyramid? And so many enterprises, go with the idea that it's too costly, complicated, or difficult to engage with the base of the pyramid and really understand impacts and poverty alleviation. But in fact, if you worked in the developed world, you'd have to do that. You'd have to have a regular conversation with your customers and understand their perspective of value. We need tools, again, to help our enterprises do this. And then finally, this is such a difficult environment to operate in. We're talking about operating in an environment that's constrained in terms of infrastructure and institutions and legal environment, and dealing with and working with consumers and producers that are constrained in terms of their resources. How do we build the right partnership ecosystem? In some respects, that's just leveraging what's happening in the developed world, where there's a lot of investment by government and others to support enterprises, be it now in clean energy or basic R&D, or certainly in the United States when we had a crisis, we supported the banking industry and the car industry. So the idea that partners invest, government invests and others invest in companies is not something unique. It's just a tool that we need to think about more clearly in the developing world. So again, if you begin to think about these 4, how do you set yourself up for success internally? What are the unique aspects of scale that you need to think about in low-income markets? How do you understand value from the perspective of the base of the pyramid and build a more robust value proposition over time? And how do you create the right set of partners to help you move this forward? So that's what I got. I think that it moves us toward fulfilling the base of the pyramid promise if we start developing strategies, frameworks, and processes that increase the likelihood of enterprise success at scale. So I'm going to stop there. That's sort of the big picture. Happy to dive in more, and I'm going to turn it back over to Caroline.
Well, thank you, Ted. I think I think you made a very strong case for tools, toolkits, and so on. What you've also made clear is that it's such a broad-ranging question, and it's not at all about just do we have the right price point or do we have the right distribution model. It's such a broad issue.
So I really love Ted's toolkit and the structure he brings, which is really badly needed because there are so many concepts and ideas floating around. Bringing some order into this chaos is extremely welcome, and congratulations for this valiant effort. Now I'm going to speak about the experience we have developed at Histra and on how to scale up. And as you see from this picture, this is not a straight road and it's going up. So it's going uphill. It's clearly a challenge, and we have seen many of our clients go through that. The experience we are basing these insights on is really working with about 50 clients over the last 7 years, starting with identifying opportunities to create inclusive business, getting the organization in place, the scale up and replication strategy, and supporting the implementation. I would say 2/3 of our work has been done with large corporates, but also foundations, aid agencies, and a number of social enterprises. And on that basis, we have developed, I would say, 4 key insights that at least were things we have learned, i.e. when we got started, we didn't know them, and are a bit, so I don't know whether you guys will find it counterintuitive, but for us, there were clearly things we would have wished to know when we got started. And I'll go into each of these 4 points. The first one is that poor people, what they want is risk-free solutions, not cheap products. That companies need creativity and courage, not generosity. And that partnerships need rigorous governance, not only trust and common purpose. And projects need leaders and best practices, much more than money. Let me go over these four points. The first one is that the key thing people think poor people or low-income consumers are people who don't have money, and therefore their money, they are poor, therefore you need to give them cheap products. It's an issue of affordability. But this is fundamentally the wrong mindset. When you look at the internal rate of return that these poor families get from investing in an improved cook stove or an irrigation pump, a water purifier, a solar lantern, or even a solar home system, you see internal rates of returns that are incredibly high. No one in the rich world has in front of him or her investments that are so lucrative. And this creates a question about what's about the price. Look at solar lanterns. If they were twice as expensive, because you replace a solar lamp with a solar lantern, you replace a kerosene lamp, the return would still be 75%, which will still be extremely high, which, by the way, explains why these families can take a microfinance loan at a huge interest rate, and still it's a good investment to make. So that's a key point, because on paper, these investments are incredibly profitable, and therefore price is not an issue. The issue is the risk, of the perceived risk of buying something which is new that people are not used to. And this is a picture from a guy in Bangladesh, actually it's from India, who is looking at this gentleman, the technician, who is installing a solar home system on their house. And as you see from the picture, the gentleman is very worried. He just bought himself something which is at that time costed $250, which he has been told would last for 15 years. And he's extremely worried that this thing is going to work or not. And in the case of Grameen Shakti, the solution they developed was to say, okay, we are going to give you a 3 years loan, but you are going to pay every month, and you are going to pay the technician. So the technician will have to come back every month to make sure your system works. And that was key in getting this farmer to commit to making such a risky investment. Extremely profitable investment, but perceived to be extremely risky. The other guy who was worried was a CFO of Grameen Shakti, who just gave a $250 loan to someone in the middle of nowhere. But the CFO suddenly knew he was going to repay his loan, otherwise the technician was not going to come to do the maintenance. So here we see that the issue is really about risk, perception of risk by the poor families, but also the need from the supplier, in that case, the distributor of solar systems, to really understand this perception of risk and find a solution that minimizes the perception of risk. It's a similar situation with CEMEX in Mexico. And I don't know if Israel Moreno or friends from Patrimonio are on the webinar, but they had registered. This remains one of my favorite cases, where in order to be able to sell more cement to poor families in Mexico, CEMEX figured out that they needed to provide a complete holistic solution that provided home delivery, that was not limited to cement, but all the building materials, that provided technical assistance in order to ensure the room that would be built would work, that also froze the prices of building materials over 70 weeks, so people knew they could actually deliver. And these 450,000 families who benefited from this program, the big difference for them is that they knew that in 70 weeks, they would get their room built. And this really transformed their lives. Now, in doing so, CEMEX had to become an architect, a financier, a distributor of building materials, all things. And you could imagine the discussion at the board of CEMEX saying, hey, we are manufacturers of cement. We are not distributors. We are not bankers. We are not architects. So clearly, in order to be able to provide this holistic solution, companies needed to get out of their comfort zone and address the complete need of their clients, and therefore take the risk of getting out of what they were used to. And that in doing so, and that's really the point Ted was making, there is a great piece of news, is that today the Social Innovation Lab is full, but the globalization plant is empty. Yes, it's empty, but the good news is that the lab is full. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. And that's one of the greatest mistakes corporates make, is that they think they need to invent everything themselves, when they can actually learn from what has already been done. And here is example of, is it working? The example of Total, with whom we worked for 3-4 years, who they understood the role they could play in distributing solar lanterns, because they realized that poor families were afraid of this new technology, but that they distributed these solar lanterns to their gas stations, putting their brand on the solar lanterns and saying, if you have a problem, you can bring it back to the closest gas station. And that's one of the wonderful things corporates have. They have assets that money cannot buy. The brand of Total, their 4,500 gas stations in Africa, were things that they could leverage at no cost, actually making a profit by selling these solar lanterns. And they were things, assets that not even the Gates Foundation could have afforded. That's what makes it interesting. And so companies need this creativity and this courage, not the generosity. In some cases, you need to work through partnerships. And we have worked with a number of companies trying to build these multi-level partnerships or multi-sectorial partnerships. And typically, it's made out of a lot of generosity. Let's break down silos. Let's work together to a common purpose. But most of them have to go through major restructuring, because it's not because it is a partnership for development that you don't need to have rigorous governance, rigorous decision-making procedures. And that is really something we have seen a lot of naivety in setting up these alliances, which should be addressed as rigorously as business joint ventures. And to finish up, the key point is that when you look at all these projects, and there are many of them, and you see lots of this money that is available through impact investors and others, what we really see today is that the bottleneck are leaders, such as the one who are listening to us today, and should be the ones speaking, I guess, but also best practices, because we see an enormous amount of reinventing the wheel. So I think today the bottleneck for us is entrepreneurs that you are well informed about what are the best practices in the world. And with this, I'm done. Thank you.